Picture this. You're hiking alone in the California mountains. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the ridge. You glance up, and there, silhouetted against the dying light, stands a figure, impossibly tall, perfectly still, watching you. You blink, it's still there. You look away for just a second, heart pounding in your chest, and when you look back, it's gone. No footprints, no sound, nothing. Just the cold certainty that something was watching you, and it wasn't human. What you just imagined isn't fiction. It's happened to dozens of people across generations in the Santa Lucia Mountains of California. They call them the Dark Watchers. Massive, shadowy figures that appear on mountain ridges at twilight, standing motionless, observing travelers below. They have no faces, no features, just dark, towering silhouettes that seem to defy explanation. The Chumash Native Americans knew about them long before Spanish settlers arrived and named them Los Vigilantes Oscuros, the Dark Watchers. For centuries, people have reported seeing these entities. Hikers, ranchers, campers, even entire school groups, all describing the same thing. A presence on the mountains that watches but never approaches, that appears without warning and vanishes without a trace. Tonight, we're going to explore real accounts from people who encountered the Dark Watchers. Their stories are chilling, consistent, and deeply unsettling. Because if these witnesses are telling the truth, then something is out there in those mountains, something that has been watching us for a very long time. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Our first account comes from a man we'll call Michael, a seasoned backpacker who spent years exploring the trails of Big Sur. In the fall of 2018, Michael set out on a solo hike along the Ridgeline Trail in the Santa Lucia Range. He'd done this route dozens of times before. It was familiar, safe, predictable. But that evening, as the sun began its descent toward the Pacific, something changed. Michael reached a clearing around 6:30 in the evening. The light was fading, turning everything into shades of amber and deep purple. He stopped to take a photo of the view, the endless mountains rolling into the distance. That's when he saw it. On the ridge about 300 yards away, standing perfectly still, was a figure. At first, Michael thought it was another hiker. Maybe someone who'd stopped to watch the sun set like he had. But something felt wrong. The figure was too tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, and it stood with an unnatural stillness. No shifting weight. No movement at all. Just standing there, facing his direction. Michael lifted his hand and waved, thinking maybe the person would wave back. Nothing. The figure didn't move, didn't react. Michael felt his stomach tighten. He pulled out his binoculars, hands shaking slightly, and trained them on the ridge. What he saw made his blood run cold. The figure had no discernible features, no face, no clothing details. Just a solid black silhouette against the sky, like someone had cut a hole in reality. And it was definitely watching him. He could feel it, that oppressive sensation of being observed, studied, judged. Michael lowered the binoculars and took a breath, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe it was a tree, a trick of the light, his mind playing games after hours of hiking. He looked down at his map for just a moment, maybe 5 seconds, and when he looked back up, the figure was gone, completely vanished. No movement, no sound, just empty ridge where, seconds before, something impossible had been standing. Michael didn't wait around. He packed his gear and hiked down as fast as he could, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes, that crawling sensation on the back of his neck never quite going away. When he reached his car, the sun had fully set. He sat there in the darkness, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what he'd seen. Michael never hiked that trail again. He told me that even now, years later, he can't shake the memory. The absolute certainty that something was watching him up there, something that had no business existing. How would you feel if you were alone on a mountain and saw something like that? Would you convince yourself it was nothing? Or would that primal fear take over? Would you run? Or would you stand frozen, unable to look away? Our second account takes us back to 1923, to a cattle ranch that sat in the foothills of the Santa Lucia Mountains. A man we'll call Thomas worked as a ranch hand, responsible for checking fences and moving cattle between pastures. It was hard work, but Thomas loved it. The solitude, the open sky, the mountains watching over everything. One evening in late October, Thomas was riding his horse back to the ranch house after a long day. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and the shadows were growing long across the valley. He was maybe a mile from home when his horse suddenly stopped and refused to move forward. Thomas had worked with horses his whole life. He knew when an animal sensed danger. The horse's ears were pinned back, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Something had spooked it badly. Thomas looked around, scanning the landscape for a mountain lion or bear. That's when he saw it. High on the ridge above the western pasture stood a figure. Massive, easily 10 feet tall from Thomas's perspective. It stood with perfect stillness, arms at its sides, facing down toward him in the valley below. Thomas squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was too large to be a person, too still to be an animal. It was just a dark shape, a shadow that seemed denser than the darkness around it. And then, as Thomas watched, the figure raised one arm. Slowly, deliberately, it lifted its right arm and extended it, as if pointing directly at him. Thomas felt ice flood his veins. His horse whinnied and took several steps backward. Thomas didn't try to calm the animal. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to leave. He turned the horse around and rode hard back to the ranch, not looking back, heart hammering in his chest. When he reached the ranch house, the other workers were sitting on the porch. Thomas dismounted and, still breathing hard, told them what he'd seen. They laughed it off. Shadows and tired eyes, they said. Too many hours in the sun. But Thomas knew what he'd seen, and he refused to work that section of the ranch after sunset ever again. Here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Thomas wasn't the only one. Over the years, other ranch workers reported seeing the same thing. A tall figure on the ridge watching the valley below. Some saw it raise its arm. Others just saw it standing there, motionless, observing. One worker in the 1940s described it as feeling like the mountains themselves were watching him. Like the land had eyes. The ranch is still there today, though it's changed hands several times. And even now, locals avoid certain trails at dusk. They won't say why exactly. They'll just tell you it's better to be home before dark. Thomas lived until 1967. Before he died, he told his grandson about that evening on the ranch. He said he'd seen a lot of strange things in his life, but nothing ever scared him like that figure on the ridge. Because when it raised its arm, Thomas felt something he'd never felt before. The certainty that he was in the presence of something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world, but had been here long before him, and would remain long after. What do you think that figure was trying to communicate? Was it a warning? A threat? Or was it simply marking Thomas, letting him know he'd been seen? If something like that pointed at you from a mountain ridge, would you ever feel safe in the wilderness again? Our third account is particularly compelling because it involves multiple witnesses, all seeing the same thing at the same time. In April of 2003, a high school biology class from Salinas took a field trip to the Santa Lucia Mountains to study local ecology. There were 22 students, 2 teachers, and 1 parent volunteer. They hiked a well-marked trail that wound through oak groves in Chaparral, eventually reaching a viewpoint overlooking a wide canyon. It was around 4 in the afternoon when they arrived. The group spread out along the viewpoint, some students taking notes, others just enjoying the view. That's when one of the students, a girl we'll call Rachel, pointed toward the opposite ridge and asked, "Who is that?" Several students and one of the teachers followed her gaze. There, on the ridge across the canyon, stood a figure. Tall, dark, motionless. At first, the teacher assumed it was a ranger or another hiker. But as more students noticed and pointed, it became clear something was off. The figure was too far away to make out details, but it was clearly humanoid and enormous. Some students estimated it at 12 feet tall, and it wasn't alone. As the group watched, more figures appeared along the ridgeline. 2, then 3, then 6 in total, all standing perfectly still, all facing the direction of the student group. The students started murmuring nervously. One boy grabbed his camera and zoomed in, but the image was too grainy to show any detail, just dark shapes against the sky. The teacher, trying to remain calm, suggested they were other hikers or maybe park rangers doing a survey. But even as she said it, she didn't believe it. The figures stood too still, too uniform, and there was something about the way they were positioned, spread out along the ridge in a line, all facing the same direction, that felt deliberate, calculated. One of the students, a boy we'll call Marcus, decided to test a theory. He stepped forward and waved both arms over his head, trying to get the figure's attention. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, one of the figures on the far left raised an arm, not waving back, just lifting it straight up, holding it there. Several students gasped. The teacher told everyone to pack up. They were leaving, now. As the group hurried back down the trail, several students kept glancing over their shoulders. The figures remained on the ridge, watching them go until the trees blocked the view. When they reached the trailhead, the teacher reported what they'd seen to a park ranger. The ranger listened politely, made a note in his logbook, and said they'd look into it. But he didn't seem surprised. He didn't ask follow-up questions. He just nodded as if he'd heard this story before. Later, when students tried to compare notes, they realized something unsettling. At least 6 of them had independently drawn sketches of what they'd seen during the bus ride home. The sketches were remarkably similar. Tall, featureless figures with elongated proportions, standing in a line along the ridge. One student wrote beneath her drawing, "They weren't people. I don't know what they were, but they weren't people." Rachel, the girl who first spotted the figures, told her parents she didn't want to go hiking anymore. She said she couldn't shake the feeling that the figures had been waiting for them, that the group had been expected. Marcus, the boy who waved, had nightmares for weeks afterward. He dreamed of standing alone on a ridge while dark figures surrounded him, closing in slowly, never making a sound. The teacher never led another field trip to that area. When asked why, she would only say that some places are better left undisturbed. This case is particularly difficult to dismiss because of the number of witnesses. 25 people saw something that afternoon. They couldn't all have been mistaken. They couldn't all have experienced the same hallucination. So what did they see? What were those figures on the ridge? And why did they seem to be watching, waiting, almost performing for the group below? If you were one of those students, seeing something impossible with your own eyes, would you trust what you saw? Or would you spend the rest of your life trying to convince yourself it was something else, something explainable, because the alternative is too terrifying to accept? So what are the Dark Watchers? If we approach this from a scientific perspective, there are several possible explanations. The most common theory is pareidolia, the psychological phenomenon where our brains perceive familiar patterns, especially faces and figures, in random stimuli. When we see shadows on a mountainside at dusk, our brains might interpret those shapes as humanoid figures. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism. Our ancestors, who were quick to spot potential threats, even false ones, were more likely to survive. Another explanation is the Brocken specter, a rare atmospheric optical phenomenon where a person's shadow is cast onto clouds or fog, often appearing enormous and distorted. This could explain the massive size of the Dark Watchers and their sudden disappearances when lighting conditions change. There's also the possibility of mass suggestion or shared expectation. If someone in a group points out a figure on a ridge, others may see it too. Not because it's actually there in any objective sense, but because their brains are now primed to interpret shadows in that way. These are all reasonable, rational explanations, They account for many of the reported sightings, but they don't account for everything. They don't explain the consistent details across centuries of reports from people who had never heard of the Dark Watchers before their encounters. They don't explain why animals like Thomas's horse react with terror. They don't explain the feeling of being watched, that visceral, primal dread that so many witnesses describe. And they certainly don't explain the cases where the figures seem to respond, raising arms or moving in ways that suggest awareness and intent. Scientists and skeptics will argue that human memory is unreliable, that fear and expectation distort our perceptions, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they're right. But they're also missing something important. The people who have seen the Dark Watchers aren't making extraordinary claims for attention or fame. Most of them are ordinary people who had an experience they can't explain, an experience that fundamentally changed how they view the world. Michael, the hiker, was a rational person with years of outdoor experience. He didn't want to see something impossible, he just did. Thomas, the ranch hand, had worked in those mountains his entire life. He knew shadows and tricks of light. What he saw wasn't a trick. Rachel and Marcus and those 23 others on the school trip weren't primed to see something paranormal. They were studying biology, looking at plants and soil. The figures appeared to them, not the other way around. So while psychological and atmospheric explanations might account for some sightings, they feel incomplete. They don't capture the full reality of what people are experiencing in those mountains. Which brings us to the other theories, the ones that venture into territory science can't easily measure or dismiss. If the Dark Watchers aren't explainable by science, then what are they? The Chumash people, who lived in the coastal ranges of California for thousands of years, have stories about the mountain spirits, beings that watch over the land, guardians of the wilderness. According to their oral traditions, these spirits appear to travelers as a reminder that humans are guests in the mountains, that we must show respect and humility. To see one is both a warning and a blessing. The Spanish settlers who encountered the Dark Watchers in the 18th century had a different interpretation. They saw them as omens, harbingers of death or misfortune. There are accounts from mission records of travelers seeing los vigilantes oscuros before accidents, illnesses, or violent encounters. Some believed they were the ghosts of conquistadors or native warriors, cursed to wander the mountains for eternity. In more modern paranormal circles, there are theories that the Dark Watchers are interdimensional beings, entities that exist just outside our normal perception, but become visible under certain conditions. Specific angles of light, atmospheric pressure, moments when the veil between worlds grows thin. This theory suggests that the mountains themselves might be a kind of threshold, a place where our reality brushes up against something else. Some researchers point to the consistent behavior of the Dark Watchers as evidence of intelligence. They don't chase, they don't attack, they watch, they observe. Sometimes they react, raising an arm or moving slightly, but always in ways that suggest purpose and awareness. If they were hallucinations or atmospheric tricks, you wouldn't expect such consistency in their behavior across hundreds of years and dozens of independent witnesses. There's also a darker theory. Some believe the Dark Watchers are predators, not of flesh, but of fear and energy. That they feed on the terror they inspire, the unease they create in those who see them. This would explain why encounters often leave people with lasting psychological effects, nightmares, anxiety, a persistent feeling of being watched even after they leave the mountains. One paranormal investigator who spent years researching the Dark Watchers claimed that certain locations in the Santa Lucia Range have higher concentrations of sightings. These spots, he argued, might be places where the boundary between our world and theirs is thinnest, natural gateways that allow the Watchers to manifest more easily. He conducted electromagnetic field readings and found anomalies in several locations, though skeptics argue this proves nothing. Equipment malfunctions, natural mineral deposits can cause strange readings, but the investigator stood by his findings until his death in 2015. He believed, without question, that the Dark Watchers were real, that they were intelligent, and that they had been watching humanity in those mountains for far longer than we've been recording history. Whether you believe in spirits, interdimensional beings, or ancient guardians, one thing is clear. The people who encounter the Dark Watchers come away changed. They don't laugh about it. They don't dismiss it as a fun, spooky story. They carry it with them, a weight that never quite lifts, the knowledge that they saw something they weren't supposed to see, something that saw them back. Our final account comes from a man we'll call David, who experienced something in the summer of 2016 that still haunts him today. David was an avid outdoorsman, someone who found peace in solitude and nature. He'd been camping alone dozens of times, all over California and beyond. He wasn't afraid of the dark or the wilderness. He respected it, understood it, felt at home in it. In July of that year, David decided to spend a weekend camping in a remote area of the Santa Lucia Mountains, far from established trails and campgrounds. He hiked in about 5 miles, found a small clearing near a creek, and set up his tent. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, warm sun, the sound of water running over stones. David cooked dinner over a small fire as the sun set, watching the light fade from gold to purple to deep blue. That's when he first noticed the figure. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards from his campsite. Tall, dark, motionless. David's first thought was that it was another camper, someone who'd wandered over to say hello. He called out, "Hey there, how's it going?" No response. The figure didn't move. David stood up, feeling a prickle of unease. He waved. Still nothing. He grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and underbrush, but where the figure had been standing, there was nothing. Just empty forest. David told himself it was a shadow, a trick of his tired eyes. He finished his meal, banked the fire, and climbed into his tent around 9 o'clock. He lay there in his sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. The creek, the wind in the trees, the occasional rustle of some small animal moving through the brush. And then around midnight he heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling his tent. David's heart began to race. He lay perfectly still, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps moved slowly, evenly, around the perimeter of his campsite. Not stumbling, not hesitant, purposeful. David reached for his flashlight and unzipped his tent slightly, peering out. At first he saw nothing. Then his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he saw it. The figure was standing about 20 feet from his tent, facing him. It was massive, at least 9 feet tall, and perfectly still. David could make out no features, no clothing, nothing. Just a solid black shape, darker than the night around it. David's hand was shaking so badly he almost dropped the flashlight. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He just lay there, frozen, staring at the figure through the crack in his tent. Minutes passed. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. David finally found his voice and shouted, "Get away from me! Leave me alone!" His voice cracked, raw with fear. The figure didn't react. For what felt like an eternity, David lay in his tent, too terrified to move, too terrified to look away. The figure remained exactly where it was, a silent sentinel in the darkness. Then, just before dawn, David must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. When he woke, the sun was rising, light flooding the clearing. David crawled out of his tent, heart still pounding, and looked around. There was no sign of the figure, no footprints, no disturbance in the grass or dirt, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. But David knew. He packed up his gear as fast as he could, hands still shaking, and hiked out. He didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept moving until he reached his car. David never went camping alone again. He told me that he tried once about a year later, but the moment the sun started to set, panic gripped him. He couldn't do it. Couldn't shake the memory of that figure standing outside his tent, watching him with eyeless malice. He sold most of his camping gear, stopped hiking, stopped going into the wilderness he once loved. When I asked him what he thought the figure was, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know. But whatever it wasn't there by accident. It came for me specifically. It wanted me to know I was being watched. And I'll never forget that feeling. The certainty that I was in the presence of something that didn't care whether I lived or died. Something that existed on a level I can't even comprehend." David's life changed after that night. He became anxious, withdrawn. He started having panic attacks whenever he was in open spaces at dusk. His relationship suffered. His mental health deteriorated. The doctors called it PTSD, said he'd had a traumatic experience and needed therapy. But David knew it was more than that. He'd looked into the face of something impossible, something that defied explanation, and it broke something inside him. He moved to the city not long after, somewhere with lights and people and concrete, far from mountains and shadows. But even there, he says, sometimes he feels it. That presence, that sensation of being watched. And he wonders if the Dark Watchers ever really let you go once they've seen you. If you were David, alone in that tent, what would you have done? Would you have run into the darkness, stayed frozen, confronted the figure? And how would you live with that memory afterward, knowing you'd seen something that shouldn't exist? The Dark Watchers don't just haunt the mountains, they haunt the people who see them. Across every account we've explored tonight, there's a common thread. These encounters leave lasting scars. Michael, the hiker, never returned to his favorite trails. He told me he used to hike every weekend, that the mountains were his sanctuary. Now he avoids them entirely. He tried going back once, a few months after his encounter, but the moment he reached higher elevation and saw the ridgelines in the distance, his chest tightened and he couldn't breathe. He turned around and hasn't tried since. Thomas, the ranch hand from 1923, refused to work certain areas of the ranch after dark for the rest of his life. His grandson said Thomas would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, sitting up in bed staring out the window toward the mountains. When asked what was wrong, he'd just say, "Making sure it's not out there." Rachel, from the school trip, developed a deep fear of open spaces and heights. She dropped out of an outdoor education program she'd been excited about and changed her college major to something that kept her indoors. She told a friend years later that she couldn't stop thinking about those figures on the ridge, the way they stood so still, so deliberately. She said it felt like they'd been waiting for the group, like the encounter was meant to happen. David's story is perhaps the most tragic. His love of the wilderness, something that had defined his identity for most of his adult life, was stolen from him in a single night. He struggled with depression and anxiety for years. He went through multiple therapists, tried medication, tried everything to reclaim the peace he once felt in nature. Nothing worked. The Dark Watchers had taken something from him that he could never get back. These aren't stories about people seeing something weird and moving on with their lives. These are stories about people whose entire worldviews were shattered. They lived in a universe that made sense, where shadows were just shadows and mountains were just mountains. And then, in a single moment, that certainty was ripped away. They saw something that shouldn't exist, something that watched them with an intelligence and intent they couldn't explain. And once you've seen that, once you've felt that, you can never unsee it. You carry it with you forever, a weight in your chest, a whisper in the back of your mind that says the world is stranger and darker than you ever imagined. The psychological impact is real and measurable. Several witnesses have described symptoms consistent with PTSD: nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, avoidance of places and situations that remind them of their encounters. Some have sought therapy, some have turned to religion or spirituality, looking for frameworks that can accommodate what they experienced. Some have simply tried to bury it, to pretend it never happened, but it did happen, and they know it, and that knowledge changes everything. So what do the Dark Watchers want? Why do they appear to certain people at certain times? Are they trying to communicate something, or are they simply observing, indifferent to the terror they inspire? Some believe the Watchers are protectors, guardians of the mountains who appear to warn travelers of danger. In this interpretation, seeing a dark watcher is actually a blessing, a sign that you're being watched over. The fear you feel isn't malice from the watcher, but your own primal recognition that you're in the presence of something powerful and ancient. Others believe the opposite, that the watchers are predators, entities that feed on fear or mark certain individuals for reasons we can't understand. In this view, an encounter with a dark watcher is a curse, something that attaches to you and follows you, feeding off your anxiety and dread for the rest of your life. There's a third possibility, one that's perhaps more unsettling than either of those. Maybe the dark watchers have no purpose at all. Maybe they simply exist, observing us the way we might observe insects or fish in a tank. Maybe we're not important enough to them to warrant protection or predation. We're just there, and they're just there. And sometimes our paths cross. And when they do, we're the ones left changed because we're the ones who need the world to make sense. They don't. They're beyond that. Some witnesses have described feeling judged when they encountered the dark watchers. Not attacked, not threatened, judged. As if the watchers were measuring them, deciding something about them. What that judgment means, if anything, no one knows. But the feeling is consistent across accounts. The sense that you're being evaluated by an intelligence you can't comprehend. There's no easy answer here. The dark watchers don't explain themselves. They don't leave messages or clues. They just stand on those ridges, silent and still, watching as the sun sets and the darkness rises. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the purpose of the dark watchers is simply to remind us that we don't have all the answers, that there are things in this world, or just beyond this world, that we'll never fully understand. That the universe is vast and strange and full of mysteries that don't care whether we believe in them or not. The Santa Lucia Mountains are beautiful. They're wild and rugged, a place where you can still feel truly alone, truly connected to something larger than yourself. Thousands of people hike those trails every year without incident. They see stunning views, breathe clean air, feel the peace that only nature can provide. But some people see more. Some people, through chance or fate or something else entirely, encounter the dark watchers. And their lives are never the same. If you ever find yourself in those mountains as the sun begins to set, pay attention to the ridgelines. Look for shapes that don't quite fit, shadows that stand too still, figures that watch without moving. If you see one, don't panic. Don't run. Just acknowledge it. Turn around calmly and leave. Because the dark watchers have been there for centuries. They were there before the Chumash. They were there before the Spanish. They were there before any of us, and they'll be there long after we're gone. They're part of the mountains now, woven into the fabric of that place. And whether they're spirits or interdimensional beings or something else entirely, they're real to the people who've seen them. Real enough to change lives. Real enough to inspire fear that lasts decades. Real enough to make grown adults afraid of the wilderness they once loved. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you're hiking at dusk and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense that you're being watched, don't dismiss it. Don't tell yourself it's nothing. Look around, check the ridges. Because maybe, just maybe, you're not alone. Maybe the dark watchers are there, silent and still, observing you from their ancient posts. And once they see you, really see you, you might find that they never quite let you go. They'll be there in your dreams, in the shadows at the edge of your vision, in that feeling you get sometimes, even in the safety of your own home, that something is watching, waiting, judging. The dark watchers don't chase. They don't need to. Because once you've seen them, they're always with you. A reminder that the world is stranger than we know, and that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be survived. If you've had an encounter with the dark watchers or seen something similar in the mountains, share your story in the comments. We read every single one. And remember, whether you believe in them or not, the dark watchers are out there, standing on the ridges, watching, always watching. Stay safe out there, and maybe, just maybe, Stay out of the mountains when the sun starts to fall. Do not forget to subscribe for more horror. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that someone is watching you? Not the feeling, not a suspicion, but a bone-deep knowledge that you are not alone in your room. Your heart starts pounding before you even open your eyes. You lie there frozen, every instinct screaming at you to look, to confirm what you already know in your gut. And when you finally gather the courage to turn your head, there's nothing there. Just shadows. Just darkness, just your imagination, right? But what if it wasn't your imagination? What if that feeling, that primal fear we've all experienced at some point, was trying to tell you something real? Sarah Mitchell felt that feeling. So did Marcus Thompson. And so did a 7-year-old girl named Emma Peterson. The difference is, for them, it didn't stop. For them, looking into the darkness revealed something that looked back, something that chose them, something that followed them home. And once it attached itself to their lives, no amount of distance, no locked door, no prayer or pleading could make it leave. Today, I'm going to share their stories with you. Real accounts from real people whose lives were forever changed by something that shouldn't exist. And I want you to ask yourself as you listen, what would you do if this happened to you? Because the terrifying truth is, it could. Before we begin, let me ask you something. How many of you have seen something out of the corner of your eye? A dark shape that moved when nothing should have been there. A figure standing in your hallway late at night that disappeared when you looked directly at it? Most of us have experienced this at least once. We brush it off as tired eyes, as shadows playing tricks, as our minds filling in blanks in the darkness. And for most of us, that's all it is. But there are people, thousands of them across the world, who will tell you it's not always just your imagination. They call them shadow people. Dark, human-shaped figures that appear without warning, without sound, without explanation. Across every culture, across every century of recorded history, humans have reported these encounters. They're not ghosts in the traditional sense. They don't speak. They don't interact. They don't seem to have any connection to people who've died. They're something else entirely. Something that exists in the spaces between light and dark, between what we can see and what we sense. And here's what makes these accounts so disturbing. When you start comparing the stories, when you listen to people who've never met, who live on different continents, who come from completely different backgrounds, they all describe the same thing. The same height, between 6 and 8 feet tall. The same movements, smooth and unnatural. The same feeling of overwhelming dread, and the same pattern. These things don't just appear randomly. They choose people, they attach, they follow. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Jennifer Walsh was 32 when her life changed forever. She was an accountant, recently divorced, living in Portland, Oregon. Completely normal life, completely rational person. She'd never believed in anything supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, paranormal phenomena, all of it seemed like nonsense to her. Until October 2021. She just moved into a new apartment, trying to start fresh after a difficult divorce. Nice neighborhood, newly renovated building, nothing unusual about the place. The first night, she woke up at 3:47 a.m. She remembers the exact time because she checked her phone, thinking maybe a notification had disturbed her sleep, but her screen was blank. No messages, no alerts, nothing. That's when she felt it. Someone was watching her. Not the paranoid feeling you get sometimes, but an absolute certainty. Like when you can feel someone's eyes on you in a crowded room, except she was alone in her apartment. She turned her head toward her bedroom door, and there in the corner, where the hallway light created a small triangle of shadow, something was standing. At first, Jennifer thought her eyes were adjusting to the darkness. You know how shadows can look like shapes when you first wake up? But this didn't fade. Instead, it became clearer, more defined. A tall, impossibly still figure, like someone had cut a person-shaped hole in reality itself. She tried to move, to sit up, to turn on the light, but her body wouldn't respond. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, could feel the sheets gripped tight in her fists, but she couldn't look away, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but stare at this thing standing in her bedroom. Then it moved, just slightly. It tilted its head like it was studying her, trying to figure out what she was. That small movement broke whatever paralysis had gripped her. Jennifer lunged for her bedside lamp, her hand shaking so badly she almost knocked it over. The light flooded the room. The corner was empty. She didn't sleep the rest of that night. She sat in her bed with every light in the apartment on, telling herself it was stress. It was the move. It was her mind playing tricks after months of emotional turmoil. Just a bad dream. Just her imagination. But the next night at exactly 3:47 a.m., she woke up again. And it was there. Closer this time. Not in the hallway anymore, but standing just inside her bedroom doorway. How would you react? Would you convince yourself it was nothing, or would you trust your instincts? Jennifer made a choice that morning. She packed a bag and left. She stayed with her sister for 3 days, making excuses about wanting company, not telling anyone what she'd really seen. On the 4th day, she went back to her apartment, packed her essentials, and broke her lease. She lost her security deposit. She didn't care. She moved to a new apartment 15 miles away. Different part of the city, different building, different everything. For 2 weeks, everything was fine. Jennifer started to relax. She'd convinced herself that whatever had happened was connected to that apartment, that old building. Maybe there was something wrong with it. Maybe carbon monoxide. Maybe some environmental factor that caused hallucinations. She'd escaped. She was safe. Then 3 weeks after moving, she woke up at 3:47 a.m., and it was there, standing in the corner of her new bedroom, in a place it should never have been able to find. That's the moment Jennifer realized the truth that would change her life. It wasn't the apartment, it was her. The thing wasn't haunting a place, it was haunting her. What do you do when something attaches itself to you like that? When it's not just watching from a distance anymore, but standing close enough to touch you? How do you live your life knowing that at any moment, it could be right there beside you? Marcus Thompson was a combat veteran, an army medic who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan. This was a man who'd seen the worst that humanity had to offer, who'd held dying soldiers in his arms, who'd made impossible life-or-death decisions under fire. Fear was something he understood intimately. When he came home to Cleveland in 2019, he thought he'd left the nightmares behind. He was wrong, but not in the way he expected. Marcus took a job at the VA hospital, night shift. He wanted to help other veterans, wanted to do something meaningful with his experience. It was during one of those night shifts, around 2 a.m., that he first saw it. He was walking down an empty corridor when he noticed someone standing at the far end, near the emergency exit. Hospital policy required all visitors to be escorted after midnight, so Marcus headed toward the figure to offer help. As he got closer, something felt wrong. The person wasn't moving, wasn't responding to his approach, and the lighting was off. The fluorescent lights overhead were working perfectly, but this figure seemed to exist in a pocket of deeper darkness. Marcus's combat instincts kicked in, that heightened awareness that had kept him alive overseas. Every sense was screaming danger. He was about 10 feet away when the figure turned, but it didn't turn like a person. It rotated in one smooth, continuous motion, like a mannequin on a turntable. No natural human movement, no shift of weight. And where the face should have been, there was nothing. Just darkness. Marcus backed up, reaching for his radio to call security, and in that 1 second he glanced down at his belt. The figure vanished, just ceased to exist. When security checked the camera footage, it showed Marcus walking down the hallway alone, stopping, backing up. No one else was there. Marcus tried to rationalize it. PTSD was common among veterans. Maybe his brain was creating threats where none existed. He increased his therapy sessions. He tried to explain it away. But then it started happening at home. Marcus lived alone in a small house he'd inherited from his grandmother. One night, about a week after the hospital incident, he was brushing his teeth before bed. He looked up into the bathroom mirror, and there it was, standing directly behind him. The shock was so intense he spun around so fast he knocked his toothbrush into the sink. Nothing. No one there. Heart racing, not understanding what was happening. Marcus looked back at the mirror. The shadow was still there in the reflection, even though the space behind him was completely empty. It stood there for 5 seconds, while Marcus watched in frozen horror. Then it faded like smoke. This became Marcus's new reality. The shadow appeared exclusively in reflective surfaces, mirrors, windows at night, the black screen of his turned-off TV, even in his phone screen when it was dark. Marcus started covering mirrors. He stopped looking at his reflection. He avoided any surface that could show him what was standing behind him, beside him, watching him. His friends noticed he was changing, becoming withdrawn, paranoid. He stopped going out because restaurants had bathroom mirrors. He couldn't explain what was happening without sounding like he was having a breakdown, but the entity was learning. 3 months in, it stopped needing reflections. Marcus would catch glimpses of it in his peripheral vision, standing in doorways, outside windows, in the corner of rooms. Always there when he wasn't looking directly. Always gone when he turned his head. By the 4th month, Marcus told me something that still haunts me. He said the worst part isn't seeing it anymore. The worst part is feeling it. He describes it as a cold spot that moves with him. He'll be at the store, and suddenly his left side goes ice cold, and he knows without looking that it's standing right next to him. This next case is the hardest one for me to talk about because it involves a child. Emma Peterson was 7 years old, living with her parents David and Christine in a quiet suburb outside Phoenix. She was a happy kid. Loved drawing, loved soccer, did well in school. A completely normal, bright little girl. In January 2023, Emma started having what her parents thought were nightmares. She told them that a tall man with no face was coming into her room at night and standing by her bed just watching her sleep. Christine and David did what any loving parents would do. They checked her room for things that might be casting strange shadows. They left a nightlight on. They reassured her that bad dreams weren't real. But the nightmares continued. Night after night, Emma grew more exhausted. Dark circles appeared under her eyes. She started falling asleep at school. Then she told her mother something that changed everything. She said the man wasn't in her dreams. He was real, and she'd seen him at school too, standing in the bathroom mirror. Christine scheduled an appointment with a child psychologist, thinking maybe Emma was dealing with anxiety. Maybe something had happened that she was processing through these visions. But before they could get to that appointment, David saw it. He was checking on Emma one night around midnight, like he always did. Her bedroom door was slightly open, and through the gap he could see Emma asleep in her bed. But standing in the corner of her room, barely visible in the glow of the nightlight, was a tall, dark figure. David's first instinct was intruder. He was reaching for his phone to call 911 when the figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided across the floor, completely silent, and stopped at the foot of Emma's bed. David couldn't move. Every protective instinct was screaming at him to burst in there, to protect his daughter, but something held him frozen. Then the figure's head turned, slowly, deliberately, until it was facing the door, facing David. It had no eyes, no face, but David knew with absolute certainty that it was looking directly at him. He finally found his voice and shouted Emma's name as he shoved the door open and hit the light switch. The corner was empty. Emma woke up crying, saying, "You saw him, didn't you, Daddy? You finally saw the man." Put yourself in David's position for a moment. Imagine watching something impossible stand over your sleeping child's bed. Imagine the helplessness, the terror, the desperate need to protect them from something you don't understand and can't fight. That night, the whole family slept in the master bedroom with all the lights on. Over the next 2 weeks, both parents saw the figure multiple times, always near Emma. Christine saw it standing outside Emma's second-floor window, even though there was nothing for it to stand on. David saw it in Emma's closet one morning, just standing among the hanging clothes. They brought in a priest. They tried every remedy they could find online. They even sent Emma to stay with her grandmother over 100 miles away, hoping distance would help. The grandmother called on the 3rd day, panicked. Emma had woken up screaming because the man was there in her grandmother's house. Then Emma started drawing, page after page of the same image, a tall, black figure with no face. But in the newer drawings, the figure wasn't alone anymore. It was holding the hand of a smaller figure, a little girl. When Christine asked about the drawings, Emma said something that made both parents pack up and leave that night. She said he told her he wants her to come with him. He says where he lives she won't be scared anymore. The Petersons abandoned their house. They drove to Colorado, stayed with family, kept moving every time they thought it had found them again, but it always did. Emma is 8 now. She still draws the figure constantly, and in every new drawing, it's getting closer. I've shared 3 stories with you today, but there are hundreds more just like them. Thousands of people across the world reporting the same experiences, the same figures, the same pattern of attachment and pursuit. So what do we make of this? Are these people all experiencing shared delusions? Are they suffering from sleep disorders, from stress, from mental health conditions that create these vivid hallucinations? Maybe. Science would tell us that's the most logical explanation. But science struggles to explain why the details are so consistent, why people who've never met describe the exact same entity, why moving doesn't help, why multiple family members see the same figure at the same time. And it struggles to explain what I've seen in the eyes of the people I've interviewed. These aren't people looking for attention. They're not trying to sell books or get famous. They're ordinary people, teachers and soldiers and accountants and parents, whose lives have been turned upside down by something they can't explain and can't escape. Jennifer still sees her shadow at least once a week. She's lost 3 jobs because of exhaustion and inability to focus. Marcus has learned to live with the constant feeling of being watched, of something standing close enough to touch him. The Petersons keep moving, keep running, knowing it won't help, but unable to stop trying. So I want to ask you, what would you do? If you woke up tonight and saw a figure standing in the corner of your room, would you turn on the light? Would you look directly at it? Or would you close your eyes and pray it goes away? Because here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Almost everyone has felt that presence at some point, that certainty that someone is watching you when you're alone, that glimpse of something dark moving in your peripheral vision. Most of us ignore it. We rationalize it. We forget about it by morning. But what if that instinct, that primal fear we all carry, is trying to tell us something real? What if some of those shadows are more than just shadows? The people I've spoken to all say the same thing. They wish they'd never looked. They wish they'd kept ignoring what their instincts were telling them. Because once you see it clearly, once you acknowledge that it's real, something changes. You become visible to it. And once it knows you can see it, it never looks away. So tonight, when you're lying in bed in the darkness and you feel that familiar prickle of fear, that sense that something is watching you, think carefully about what you do next. Because sometimes the things we see in the corner of our eyes are more real than we want to believe. And sometimes, looking back is an invitation. Let us know in the comments if you've ever experienced anything like this. Have you ever felt watched when you were alone? Have you seen something you couldn't explain? Share your stories with us. And remember, stay safe out there, because the darkness is always watching and sometimes it watches back. Hit the subscribe button for more horror.